Bonjour, Renee Rote Indishnakas. I am a domestic violence advocate working for Fondulac Social Services. Today we're going to be talking about debunking the myths of sex trafficking. The advocate services help victims of trafficking, and we have a crisis line. That number is 218-348-1817, and that line is open 24/7.
Bonjour, Ginawa. Caroline Indigenikas. I am the General Crime Victim Advocate for Fondulac, and today we have the pleasure to talk with Bobbi Jo Patzernik, who has served 27 years as a sworn police officer and now works with the Bureau of Criminal Apprehensions and with the Minnesota Human Trafficking Investigators Task Force. And our second guest is Chris Stark, who is a writer and organizer. She's been doing social justice work for 32 years, and she's Anishinaabe and Cherokee. And we are very happy to have both ladies with us today.
So, Bobbi Jo, my first question to you is, can you share with us the variations of federal and state definitions of sex trafficking?
Sure. Thank you, Renee. Hello, everybody. So what I want to tell you about our statute in Minnesota from the law enforcement perspective is we love our Minnesota statute. Sex trafficking in Minnesota says receiving, recruiting, enticing, harboring, providing, or obtaining by any means an individual to aid in the act of prostitution of the individual or receiving profit from the act as described above. So what that means is there is a third party who is aiding in a commercial sex act. And I also want people to understand that a commercial sex act doesn't have to be in exchange for money. People get that confused and they believe that money has to exchange. Our statute says profit or anything of value, and that is extremely subjective, right? So if we're talking about the different populations of individuals that are trafficked, anything of value could be literally, a McDonald's cheeseburger or a warm place to sleep for the night. It could be in exchange for drugs. And so that's important to understand. When you compare our statute to our surrounding states and our federal partners, in their statute, the words force, fraud, or coercion are elements of the crime, okay? Think about how hard force, fraud, or coercion is to prove, especially when we're talking about a predatory crime where the predators are preying on vulnerable individuals and utilizing things like manipulation or fear, intimidation. Those things are not tangible evidentiary things that we can prove. So when you look back at our statute, anything that aids in the act of that commercial sex act. So for example, somebody that's transporting a victim to the commercial sex act, or somebody that's posting sex advertisement through the various websites, or it could be purchasing clothing for the pictures, taking the pictures. All of those different items that would be aiding.
Thank you, Bobbi Jo. I have a question for Chris. Chris, we know that sex trafficking is not what most people think it is. Today, we're talking about debunking those myths about sex trafficking. So what do you think people need to know in order to recognize sex trafficking today?
Yeah, that's a good question. And, I think there's a lot of misinformation out there. And some of it stems from historical misinformation, like the kind of myths that, sex trafficking is a career choice. It's really fun. It's like Pretty Woman. You're going to have all of this power and all of this money and influence. Those are kind of older entrenched myths. But some of the newer myths actually have been propagated by some people who have started doing this work maybe within the past 10 or 15 years. And a lot of the imagery and ideas that they put out there are also very unhelpful. Like, for instance, women shoved in, pickle jars, or, women shown, in, tied up with duct tape and rope and so on. And what that does is it really obscures how it actually functions for most victims who are not going to be abducted, from the Mall of America, although that does happen, but they're not going to be abducted from the Mall of America. They're going to be groomed by people that they know, including family members and friends, sometimes in a slow process, sometimes in a faster, more brutal, violent process. But think about it, if you're a group of, perpetrators who are looking to make money off of selling human beings for sexual use, what's the easiest and best way that you're going to do that? You're not going to grab somebody, a stranger up off the mall and bind them and toss them in your trunk. You're going to invite them to a party. There's going to be a party. There might be a party on the ships, or there might be a party at a house, or a party here, or a party there. And so to really be aware of the sort of invitations or processes of being given free things. Here's a cell phone, here's some nice clothes, here's this is all part of that grooming process, that perpetrators will use to draw you in. And then, what a lot of the, women and girls and sometimes boys talk about is the next thing that they know, they've been given all of this stuff, and now they're being told that they need to go to a hotel room and have sex, with a couple of men in exchange for, I gave you all this stuff, now you got to do this for me. I mean, that's one, I think common way that you can identify sex trafficking. However, it also happens through family members. It can be intergenerational. And, that can be difficult to identify from the outside, because really it's just the identifiers of abused and battered women and children. And so you might see that in the school system. You might see a child, acting in particular ways that kind of, raise some red flags and make you wonder. You have to be open and aware to the possibility that part of what that child or your neighbor, your the woman next door who you hear being battered, that sex trafficking can be a part of that. We, not saying that that it is, but it's a part of that, and it's much more common than people understand. It's happening in all of our communities and in our neighborhoods, and we're all being impacted directly or indirectly by it.
Thank you, Chris.
So, Bobbi Jo, Native women are the most targeted population for sex trafficking. Do you have specific information or statistics to share about Native women in sex trafficking?
Sure, I think actually Chris will be a good person to share the statistics, but what I will tell you is Native Americans are trafficked at a disproportionate number. And because of that, about now over 3 years ago, several task forces were formed across the state of Minnesota. Ours is one of them, the BCA Task Force, which is a statewide task force that investigates human trafficking. But the Trust Task Force, which is the Tribes United Against Sex Trafficking Task Force, was also formed. And within that task force, I believe it's 11 tribes that signed on to collaborate and work together across the state of Minnesota to specifically work on sex trafficking investigations related to the various tribes throughout our state. I can tell you from our experience working investigations that Native American victims in general are a high commodity. They are sought after by both the buyers and the traffickers. Words that have been used to describe the reason for this from their viewpoints, especially the sex buyers, is that they're considered exotic. And so wherever there is a commodity that can be sold, there is going to be what we call a demand for it. And there are going to be traffickers that prey on the vulnerabilities of the Native American population so they can exploit them.
Thank you.
The MMIW report that we recently released just last week, actually, one of the statistics from that is that Native American women make up 1% of the population in the state of Minnesota, yet they're 8% of the murdered. And then we also know that a lot of times Native women are not identified, they're misidentified. They're identified as maybe white or Asian or African American. And so, the statistics on that could very well also be higher. Would you like me to talk briefly about the Garden of Truth? A few statistics from that right now?
Absolutely.
So the Garden of Truth, the prostitution and trafficking of Native women in Minnesota. I was one of the, I think there were like about 5 of us through MUSAC, and then also through an organization called Prostitution Research and Education. And we interviewed 105 Native prostituted and sex trafficked women. So some of the women, about half of the women had traffickers or pimps, and the other half of the women did not have a trafficker or a pimp. That's an important point of distinction for Native women. And one of the things that we want to talk about that is to not separate prostituted and trafficked women, because there's so much profound exploitation prior to being in prostitution, and because the acts of prostitution themselves are exploitative, violent, and dehumanizing, and profoundly racist as well. And also 80% of trafficked women got into, or of prostituted women were brought into prostitution via trafficking. So they were first trafficked and then they ended up being on their own. And, we want to talk about the issues of poverty, racism, intergenerational trauma, the ongoing legacy of colonization, and all of these different pieces, barriers to education and so forth, that create a situation that can be very difficult for a lot of Native women to be able to live their lives the way that they want. So just a few statistics from the Garden of Truth is that almost 80% of the women had been sexually abused as children by an average of 4 perpetrators. So really, when we're talking about the trafficking and prostitution of adult women, at the core of that is sexual abuse. So at the core of the trafficking and prostitution of Native women in this state is child sexual abuse. One woman that I interviewed in Duluth, who was almost 60 years old, sat down with me and started yelling at me, "I've been raped my whole life. What else do you want to know?" And then after a while, she ended up talking about how at the age of 4, she had been used by family members in pornography. And so we hear those kinds of stories over and over again. And up in that Duluth area, we interviewed almost half of the women that we interviewed for our whole study were from Duluth. And we could have continued those interviews, but we ran out of resources, and we ran out of, frankly, the ability of the interviewers. There were 4 of us up there to continue to do the interviewers. So this study really has a significant representation from that area. One more story just to that really conveys the impact of, or the connections between sexism, racism, colonization, is that one of the women up in that area was being trafficked by a wealthy white man from the Twin Cities. And she had just gotten out of a homeless shelter up there, a battered women's shelter, because he had beaten her so badly. And he would bring his white wealthy friends up from the suburban areas and traffic her and some of her friends to his men, like out on a farm in the area. And one of the things that she talked about was that he forced her to role play John and Pocahontas with him. So again, like the racism you know, and that intersection with sexism is just right at the center of what the women talked about.
Thank you, Chris. Bobbi Jo, can you tell us about the ways traffickers recruit their victims in your experience as a police officer and an investigator? What have you seen of the ways traffickers use their victims, lure their victims to?
Sure. So Chris talked a lot about this already, but from our standpoint, social media is a true evil. A lot of recruitment is happening over social media, and there are so many social media sites that we can't keep up with them. We can't keep tabs on them. And so, of course, on social media, anybody can be anybody. And a lot of it is, you know, through the words and through the language. And like Chris said, sometimes the grooming process can be months. Sometimes it can be a couple of days. But through the getting to know you stages and the promises that are made over social media, the traffickers are trying to produce something for the potential victims that they don't already have. So they're trying to fill that gap, to draw them and to get their trust so that eventually that individual will want to come and be with them. So that's what we see a lot. But there's other ways. Chris talked about homeless shelters. I mean, we literally have traffickers sitting outside our homeless shelters and watching for who they think they can prey on and making contacts there. Bus stops, you know, the Greyhound, the Jefferson lines, they'll sit at the bus stops and they'll watch for the kids to come off that, you know, maybe they don't have a lot of possessions or they look malnourished or, you know, they're good at identifying these vulnerabilities. And then they'll friend them. They'll just take them for a cup of coffee and offer them, you know, something nice, luring them in and getting their trust. Pretty much everywhere that someone can be out in a public place or, you know, where kids are going to be or vulnerable individuals are going to be, that's where they're going to go after them. So I have one example that I think kind of hits close to home when we're talking about especially the tribal reservations in northern Minnesota. We had an investigation where on social media, a very seasoned trafficker recruited a young lady out of one of the northern reservations and ended up putting her on a bus. She ends up in Minneapolis, downtown Minneapolis. And if you look at her background, her historical background, where she came from, you know, lived in poverty, you know, broken home, a lot of chemical dependency within the home, low self-esteem, you know, everything that we look at as red flags. Well, that trafficker found it in this young lady. She gets off the bus in Minneapolis and she tells us she looks around and she sees the most beautiful, big buildings she has ever seen. Okay, I don't like going to Minneapolis. Like, that does not entice me at all. But for her, someone who says, I hadn't even been off the reservation that much. I hadn't been to the city. This was like, wow, you know, this is the most beautiful thing in the world. She said, I would have done anything for that man. And so she was hooked, stepping off that bus. And that's how simple trafficking recruiting can actually be. Sad, true story.
Very good example.
I can just add just a tiny piece to that too. I'm a survivor of trafficking and other forms of sexual violence that I was born into. Members of my family were traffickers. They were pimps, and they sold me from the time I was very little. I was using an organized group, and when you live in that world, you see it everywhere. And so I can go down to, some event down in, Loring Park or whatever, where there's a lot of people, and I can see the perpetrators down there looking around, looking for, young people, watching them, looking for the ones that they're interested in. I can look around me and see the people walking around that clearly through their body language and other things, show that they have been through something. So, it's a very real awareness and a very real consciousness, that you may not notice if you're not like privy to that world, but the people who have been used in it, and the people who are perpetuating it, it's happening all the time around us at art events, down in Loring Park or wherever. So I just wanted to, add that it's pretty easy to identify.
Thank you for sharing.
So Chris, I have another question here. There's a myth about sex trafficking that perpetuates the idea that people in prostitution made that choice. They can leave whenever they want and go back to it because they like it. How do you respond to that kind of assumption?
Yeah, I mean, that's a old, myth that comes out of European cultures, right? And this issue of prostitution and trafficking comes out of those cultures. And it just is a way for people to turn away from the victimization, and turn away from the predation, the perpetrators who are doing this. Because when you look at the victimization, you have to understand then that the world that you're living in, that you don't see this kind of perpetration happening around you, and you're not maybe aware of it, is happening around you, and going on pretty much throughout every single day. So it serves to keep the systems of prostitution and trafficking in place. And we can see from understanding the statistics and listening to the women and the youth or any transgender people or two-spirit people who have been used in this, that the exact opposite of true. In the Garden of Truth, 92% of the women that we talked to wanted to leave immediately, but were unable to do so. I did another, as a graduate student at UMD, I did another study with Native women who have been trafficked on the ships in the Duluth Harbor. And, one of the women looked at me and she said, "What difference does it make if I want to get out?" She's like, "It doesn't matter because I can't. There's nowhere for me to go." And so it's just really a turning away of the reality of those of us who have been used in it and who continue to be used in it. I would really encourage people to look at studies like the Garden of Truth. It's online. And there's been a number of other studies done throughout many countries, and they all show the same kinds of statistics: high levels of sexual violence, physical violence, high levels of dissociation as a way to, survive that, chemical and drug use as a way to survive it. The numbers just go on and on, showing the trauma. Maybe perhaps one of the most sobering statistics is that over half of the women exhibited post-traumatic stress disorder in the same range with combat war veterans. So
Wow.
it's just, it's something that's really important for people to look into and to think about, and really also investigate your own response to that. Like, does that make you feel like angry or, sort of dismissive when you hear about the amount of violence, that people experience in this? And if that's so, why does that make you feel that way? Because we need to interrogate our own personal responses to this information as well. And the other piece is that in the United States of America, the vast majority of the men who are buying and selling other people for sexual violence, for rape, are white professional men. And so, we have to be looking at this. We have to be understanding the power dynamics. This is not a choice of some, child or, some adult woman who needs to feed her children and and doesn't have the ability to make enough money to clothe her children and buy diapers for her children, and has to turn to prostitution in order to take care of herself and her children. Who has the power and who has the choice? Because the men have, they don't have to engage in that. The women are engaging in it in order to survive, and out of, past experiences and current experiences of violence, men could give that woman, down on the street corner, or, that they're ordering up over the telephone, they could give them that money and not make them do anything for it. That's where the choice is. The choice is with the power and the financial power. And that's with the buyers and sellers of people in prostitution and trafficking.
Right. Thank you, Chris. Bobbi Jo, Chris was talking about the men, the white men, and there's also, I think from the last studies that were done, it shows that young boys are now trafficked as well. So that's a myth also, that there are only women. There's a lot of women for sure. A lot of girls are taken into sex trafficking, and there are also boys up to, I don't know, 25, I believe, is the age when they get out, most of them on average. Can you tell us of your experience regarding that? And also, can you explain to us what is called a bottom and other roles that they have in sex trafficking?
Sure. So we don't talk a lot about the boys that are being trafficked, and it is unfortunate. In our experience, there is a high demand for boys and for LGBTQ, and no matter what, if there's a demand for it, they are going to produce it. Okay. So I can tell you from experience, we do, some undercover operations. If I am advertising a boy, by far, that advertisement will be hit solid and fast because of the demand for boys.
Mm-hmm.
So we also have to, as we're doing community awareness, remember that we're not just talking about girls.
Mm-hmm.
I think that that's very important. And I think, I'm at fault too, just because it's under-identified, and the male victims are harder to identify for us as well. So they seem to be the forgotten victims. One thing I wanted to say, when Chris was talking about, the idea that the victims have a choice. This is one of the hardest concepts for the general public to understand. And when we are out there doing community outreach or presentations, even to our law enforcement partners, this concept is so hard to understand that I've had, law enforcement partners say, well, what the heck, because they're not locked in cages, the door's open, they can walk out that door. How is it that they're being trafficked? We talked about the force, fraud, and coercion as part of the statutes for our surrounding states. Well, they are locked. They are locked in their minds because of the amount of threats, fear, manipulation, and violence that they are going through. So, yep, that door might be open, and physically, could they walk out? Sure. But they know that if they do, there's going to be consequences. And so it's very important to wipe away that image that Chris was talking about, these kids shoved in cages and bound by handcuffs or ropes, and understand that this is a crime of predators utilizing vulnerabilities of individuals. Sorry if I lost and kind of went on a rant. That's one of the things that I get really frustrated with. As far as the sex buyers, you were talking about professional white men. That is our normal demographic of individuals buying sex. And that's another myth. People think that our sex buyers are, you know, the scum of the earth, non-educated, low economic status, criminal histories, on and on, right?
Mhm.
Well, generally speaking, when we are arresting our sex buyers, we are arresting a white male, married, kids, affluent, well-educated, and very little, if no, criminal history. Most of them don't even have a traffic ticket on their record. This is their deep, dark secret that nobody knows about. We arrest doctors and lawyers. It's going to be the individual sitting in church in the pew next to you. It's going to be the people that you would least suspect. Now, having said that, yes, we have arrest all walks of life, but those are the people that generally are buying sex in our state and in our country.
Okay.
Yeah, a bishop was just arrested in Canada with tens of thousands of images of child torture pornography on his cell phone. So, you know, just to really reiterate what Bobbi Jo is saying, that yeah, they come, you know, the perpetrators come from all walks of life, but they are the average white man in the United States.
Yeah, and then Caroline, you had asked about what a bottom is. So within the sex trafficking industry, they have their own lingo. And it's important to recognize that lingo because that will help identify a potential trafficking situation. And so words like the life, the game, family, wifey, sis-in-law, bottom, daddy, turnout, out of pocket, in call, out call, that's all part of the lingo. And so a bottom in a trafficking organization is this. Most traffickers have multiple victims, and the bottom is actually the top girl. That's the queen, that's the wifey, that's the trusted victim that also is given the orders to take care of the rest of the victims. And when I say take care of, that means keep them in pocket, keep them in line. So it's that real gray area because that individual could still be a victim of trafficking. That individual is being directed by the trafficker, probably is still going out and having to perform commercial sex acts, but at the same time, could be projecting violence on the other victims in that particular organization. So if they don't project the violence that they're directed to do by their trafficker, then more than likely they're the ones that are going to have the violence directed at them.
Thank you, Bobbi.
Thank you. So, Chris, regarding pornography and the recruitment on social media today, as a survivor of sex trafficking, how would you expose the direct link between sex trafficking, porn, and prostitution?
Yeah, I tend to, you know, they've become very sort of separated in the particularly in the past 20 years or so, and they're all forms of if we want to call it systems of prostitution or commercial sex or the sex industry. So pornography, you know, we have the child and the adult pornography, and changes have happened now with the amount of technology that's readily available. So somebody might take a picture of themselves and like post it online and they don't have a shirt on and call that pornography. But we're talking about an industry that is connected and functions together so that there can be grooming and there can be trafficking that's occurring across all of those different sort of definitions. You might have a child who is being used in pornography and who's being shown pornography in order to groom them to do more pornography or to act in, you know, sex trafficking that's not being videotaped. but the industries are very, very much connected. And, you know, the way that I view them, I'm not talking about, again, like somebody taking their cell phone and taking a picture of themselves. But they're connected in the way that you have essentially, you know, people who are in prostitution or trafficking can be shown pornography to be told what the perpetrator wants them to act out. It can be part of the abuse itself committed by a John or a pimp. And they can go back and forth between those different definitions. So you might be in sex trafficking, performing in sex trafficking, or having sex trafficking happen to you, and also be used in pornography as a part of that. So I see them as very, you know, not very separate, and as very something that they move back and forth between in terms of victimizations, but also the perpetrators will also move back and forth using pornography, using sex trafficking, you know, using people in sex trafficking. And so they're much more fluid, I think, than people understand. And the other thing to consider in this and to keep in mind is that, you know, prostitution, sex trafficking, pornography are forms of sexual violence. And so the kinds of understandings that we have around the dynamics of domestic violence, of incest, of rape, and other forms of sexual exploitation, those same dynamics exist in the prostitution, trafficking, and pornography. And so it's important for us to understand those dynamics, and that helps us to understand then what is happening to victims, and also why victims might react the way that they do. They might defend the perpetrator sometimes in the way that somebody who's in a situation of domestic violence might defend, you know, the partner who is, you know, battering or abusing her. So it's just really important for us to understand that these different silos are connected. You know, so I don't know what part of me was a survivor of incest. I don't know what part of me was a survivor of pornography. I don't know what part of me was a survivor of sex trafficking. They're all forms of rape and sexual exploitation.
Thank you, Chris. And I think also it's important to mention the number of people who get hooked on pornography now. And they actually found the what they call the PIED, the PIED, porn-induced erectile dysfunction, for some men that are unable to get aroused unless they are watching porn. And I'm thinking of all these men also who cannot do what they see in pornography, which is, as you said, Chris, pretty violent most of the time now these days. It's not the pornography that existed 30 years ago. It's a pornography that is very violent, aggressive, and against women especially. And now they go to see prostitutes or prostituted people to enact those things that they see on movies. And I think the impact of porn is more than people usually recognize. That's
yeah, it's happening to real people. So it's you know, oftentimes like put out there as a fantasy. However, a fantasy is not a camera and maybe, you know, 3 people setting up the scene, and then 4 people who, you know, 2 of whom are being raped and 2 of whom are raping. It's not a fantasy. These are pictures of real people going through these things. Mm-hmm. And studies show that actually, you know, child pornography is going through the roof in terms of its availability and use, and that the younger the child, the more violent and brutal the violence that is committed against that child. And the other thing to mention is the amount of money that's involved in pornography and in sex trafficking and prostitution. We're talking about a multi-billion-dollar global industry. So that is one way that it is set apart from other forms of sexual exploitation. People are making big money off of this. Corporations are making money off of this. And they're going to do what they need to do and put out public, you know, information publicly to counteract the violence that's inherent to this industry, because they're making tons of money off of it.
You can pay lobbyists when you make billions of dollars, for sure. Yes. Bobbi Jo, Native youth has the highest number of all kinds of negative circumstances like homelessness, runaways, addiction, suicides. And we sometimes hear of out of control youth, or that they cannot be saved. And it's really sad to hear that kind of things. But how do we protect our most vulnerable youth from being viewed as out of control and lost, and basically we can't do anything for them?
Well, I think it's important for all of us, for all of the systems and our communities, to start understanding that we have to change the mindset, okay? It's not about what the youth has done or is doing. It's about taking a different perspective and looking at what has happened to that youth. So we talk about historical trauma. Chris talks a lot about historical trauma, but what led to the homelessness or the runaways or the addictions? You know, trying to unpack that and understanding that viewpoint.
Yeah, I heard that the youth either flees from something or goes towards something that they are lacking. So it's all good for traffickers here.
100%. Yep, that's exactly what we've been talking about so far this morning.
Mm-hmm.
So, Chris, there are hubs for sex trafficking, and one of them has been the Twin Ports area. You led some serious research along with Sandy Pierce regarding this phenomenon. Could you talk about it for people who are not aware of it?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I'll try to be brief. And, you know, we did the Garden of Truth, and that was with USAC and PRE. That was back in, I think, 2011 or something like that. It was a while ago. And then as a graduate student, I did the interviews with Native women who had been sex trafficked on the ships in the Duluth Harbor. And that led me to do some historical research. And part of the reason I wanted to do that is because it's really important for us in the Native community to link up sex trafficking and prostitution with colonization and the attempted genocide, as my aunt Earl Hoagland always called it. And so I did a little bit of historical research up in that area. And, you know, people tend to think, especially in rural areas, you know, that, well, either they think, well, this isn't really happening here, or, well, maybe it just started happening here 10 years ago. But when we look at the Iron Range and that Duluth area, what we see is the historical connections between the mining and then also the shipping industry, which of course, you know, did a really, you know, became very it became very popular because of the, you know, use of the lumber and the animals and you know, then the minerals and so forth. And so we see all of that connection between the destruction of the natural resources and the shipping industry. And then we see things on the Iron Range, like right on the edge of the Red Lake Reservation in the 1800s. A white Bemidji man owned a squaw house of ill fame, which means ill fame means brothel. So that was back in the 1800s. You know, I found Duluth police records that showed in the 1800s the name of the woman who was arrested, her race, Indian, and then her occupation, whore. And so we have all of this historical embedding of this system of use, particularly of Native and Indigenous women up in that area. And it's all connected with, you know, the use of different natural, quote unquote, natural resources, and then being shipped in and out of the harbor. And then the amount of prostitution and trafficking that has been occurring through that shipping area as well. It's not just something that happened on the ships, but then, you know, the systems of prostitution and trafficking grew up in the area around the port as well. And so that is why I think that we had, over half of the women, or roughly half of the women from the Garden of Truth, were from the Duluth area, because it's been systematically embedded and institutionalized in that area. And it's targeted Native women, Anishinaabe women in particular, but not only Anishinaabe women in the northern Minnesota area.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Chris. Bobbi Jo, another myth that we often hear about is that we tend to think that sex trafficked victims all come from different countries and that they're not American. How do we educate our communities regarding this issue? Because we know, as people working in the fields, that they are from our communities as well, and it's hard to make that message clear.
Yeah. So I think what's most important is to first educate ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And there's different ways to do that. One website that I can recommend is the Polaris.org. It's POLARIS.org. They have a ton of information on their website, links that you could spend all day going through all of their information. And there's also another program for understanding the dangers of internet and social media, like we talked about. That's called Net Smarts, SMARTZ. And that's more for the dangers of kids getting on the social media. But first, educate ourselves, being able to recognize and talk about the red flags that we've been talking about through this piece today. And then become active, start doing community engagements, start reaching out. Community reach outs have been so successful across our state. I'm constantly going all over the state, working with, many different facets of our communities. Unfortunately, what that has done is it has produced a lot of work for us, way more than we can keep up with. But it's important. It's important to raise that awareness across our own communities and understand that the metro is not the only place that trafficking happens, and that trafficking happens all across our state, from each corner of our state and everywhere in between. And so understanding that by the communities keeping their heads in the sand and thinking that their community is clear from this crime, the traffickers are going to take advantage of that, and they do. Mm-hmm. And they'll swoop in on that social media account, on that vulnerable kid. They'll groom that child, and the child will be down in the metro or Chicago, wherever that particular trafficker is running from. So open up your eyes and step up and become active in making our communities aware.
Thank you. I think it's also important that we have some discussions with our children as well about, the red flags, or, just having like a close communication with them. Where I like the bond between parent and child, where they feel safe enough, the child feels safe enough to be able to tell the parent anything without being judged or shamed or in trouble. Mm-hmm. That is also really very, very important to have that.
Yeah, at a very young age too, because they get their phones now. They're 10 years old, and they start, not everybody thinks of putting filters or firewalls or systems that make sure that what they are going to visit is okay. But we really have to protect them on their devices, because that's the weapon of the future for traffickers.
Especially with like social media, that's also just...
Yeah. Chris, anyone who studies sex trafficking or works in the field soon realizes that criminalizing people who are being prostituted is a further harm to somebody who's already a victim, further injustice to the hardships they are already going through. One of the first steps all of us in the field think should be taken is to decriminalize all the victims of sex trafficking. And I'm talking about the victims, which our Minnesota Safe Harbor Protocol does up to 24 years old or younger, but not after 24 years old. We know that once you have a record, because you've been prostituted, you have trouble finding a job, you have trouble finding housing, and it's further victimizing the women who are the women or the boys who are taken into sex trafficking. Can you tell us more about how the equality model works, also called the Nordic model, or close to the safe harbor for all in Minnesota?
Yeah, so they've had success with that in other countries with what they call the Nordic model and what we're now calling the equality model. And so what that does is it decriminalizes anyone who's being bought or sold, prostitution or trafficking, and then it criminalizes the men who are doing the buying, and then also it provides services. Direct services for anyone who has been in or is in prostitution or trafficking, so that they can make the choice and have the options to get out and to do something else with their lives. As we see consistently, over 90% of the people in prostitution and trafficking want to leave immediately. That's a very high number. So providing all of those along with the public awareness campaign has shown to be effective. No law is perfect. No law is going to, take care of every single situation and make every single situation better. But there's been success with that, and it's something that we really support and hope to see happen. And in terms of the age, the one other thing that I just want to say quickly with that is this idea that someone is 18 years old and they've already been trafficked for the last 6 years and probably sexually abused since they were a young child. Turning 18 does not magically change the circumstances of your life. It doesn't remove all of the harm that has been caused to that person, and it doesn't automatically send that young person on their way to, say, Harvard. Like this idea that like you turn 18 and everything's good and you're an adult and you're making a choice that has no connection to the reality of the lives of the people who are used in it. And we know that the vast majority of adults who are in prostitution or trafficking were prostituted or trafficked, from the time that they were 12, 13, 14 years old. So those connections are important, and it's like you listen to people talking about sending their children, like kind of white, middle class folks talking about sending their children off to college at 18, and they're so concerned about them and how will they eat, and all of these sort of like really special sort of attitudes that are reserved for 18, 19, 20, 21-year-olds who are on their way to college. Yet for somebody who turns 18 and has been in prostitution or trafficking, well, good luck, or turns 25, well, good luck. We need this services, and we need this care and love and lack of judgment for everyone, regardless of their gender, regardless of their race, regardless of their age, who's been harmed in these ways.
So, Bobbi Jo, why is it so crucial to hold exploiters accountable in the sex industry?
We're criminal investigators, and we take a two-pronged approach to this, and I'll tell you why. So we ultimately want to make a prosecutable case on a sex trafficker, on the predator that's preying on multiple victims. And our goal is to send them to prison for as long as we can. We talked about how traffickers normally don't have just one victim. They may have a whole history of victims, or they have multiple victims that they are controlling at the same time. So if we can put that trafficker away, then we ultimately are helping to recover victim survivors from that trafficker's past and current and future. The other piece about this is Sex trafficking is really based on the basic business model of supply and demand. Okay. So having said that, our group also finds it extremely important to attack that demand, right? If we go after the sex buyers, the ones that are creating this demand, we attack them, meaning we arrest as many as we can. We're trying to take out that demand so that the traffickers don't have to supply the victims. So both sides of that approach are extremely important in order for, like Chris talked about, for us to be able to get these victim survivors the services that they need. And so having said that, we also work collaboratively on a daily basis with our victim service providers throughout the state. And when it comes to the victims involved in our investigation, that's where we collaborate with the victim service providers with Safe Harbor, and we work with them to make sure that that particular individual is getting the right services for that individual.
Thank you.
So, Bobbi Jo and Chris, I have a question for the two of you, and it's the same question. What would you tell young women and men to help protect the victims and protect themselves from sex traffickers? Can we think of ways of men talking to other men, friends talking to other friends? I think it's a subject that it's sometimes hard to tackle, whether it's with your children or with your family. This whole sex trafficking subject is sensitive, and many people don't want to talk about it. I think there are some ways to do some prevention. Can you tell us, Bobbi Jo, if you want to start, how you would do that?
So I think that we have to start by talking, like you mentioned before, talking to our kids at a young age, which is hard for parents to do, right? We're talking about sex.
Yeah.
Ultimately, we're not talking about sex. What we're trying to educate our children on a young age, what the dangers of social media and things that could happen to them. But what about talking to our boys about respecting girls and talking to our girls about respecting ourselves and about self-image and the different vulnerabilities that a young girl, I mean, obviously growing up, that I went, having those important conversations. There's, I think you could look at and get some understanding of some of these conversations. It's called the Don't Buy It Project. And it's about men talking to men about some of these issues. But again, if we start at a young age with our kids and teaching them about respect and boundaries, I think that's the key for prevention.
And consent. Chris, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think that as you know, an Anishinaabe woman, the most profound healing by far that I found is through ceremonies and through learning traditional ways and learning traditional culture. And to add to what Bobbi Jo is talking about, just the tremendous importance in bringing forward language immersion programs, teaching young people, their our proper roles according to our culture, and raising them up in those ways is that just cuts across so many different pieces, including prevention, because this is not traditional behavior. This is not a traditional way of living for Anishinaabe and for most Indigenous people in North America or Turtle Island. So I just think that going to that and looking to those ways in order to heal as well, if you have been harmed sexually or physically, looking to traditional ways to heal using your tobacco. Those are all just tremendously powerful ways to live that undercut this industry of exploitation.
Yeah, and I talked some time ago with Anton Troyer, who's an Ojibwe professor, and I asked him if the word prostitution existed in Ojibwe, and he said no, it doesn't. I can make it up. I can create the word, but it does not exist. So to relate to what you were saying, Chris, about the concept of prostitution being brought by Europeans into the native communities it's really what happened, and it's really sad. So you're right, looking into traditions to bring back those values and self-esteem and everything that goes with it is very important. Thank you.
Yes, thank you both, Chris and Bobby Joe, for meeting with us here today, for sharing your information, knowledge, and experience. We really, really appreciate it very much. Um, Chris, is there anything that you're currently working on, like any new projects or anything that you would like to share with us?
Oh, I have my second novel is coming out in the spring, and so I'm very excited about that. It's called Carnival Lights, and then I'm going to be working on expanding the historical piece that I wrote about trafficking in Minnesota, especially in northern Minnesota. So I'm gonna kick that research into a little higher gear as soon as I get this novel done.
Great. Great.
That's fantastic. And Bobby Joe, is there a number that people can call to get in touch with the task force if they have any questions or any reports or anything that they would like to make?
Yeah, so the BCA has a 24/7 operations center, and you can call directly into that operations center and get anybody any day of the week, anytime. That number is 651-793-7000. I'll also give you a 1-800 number. It's goes to the same operations center. It's 1-877-996-6222. And when you call the operations center, all you need to do is ask for the human trafficking investigators. Most of the time, to be honest, they call my cell phone and whatever time of the day or night, wake me up and put me in contact with whoever's on the other line. But if for some reason I'm out in the middle of the lake fishing or don't have cell service, we do have a calling tree, and they will put the individual in touch with somebody from our task force. And so that's open for law enforcement to call. We actually have potential victim survivors that reach out and request assistance or want to talk to the task force, as well as any community member that wants to report information.
Thank you. I'm just going to share again our Fondulac crisis line number in case anybody wants to reach us, and we have those numbers. We can give those resources as well. If you are aware of some weird things going on and you suspect trafficking, don't hesitate and give us a call. We can always report that as well. So that number is 218-348-1817. And thank you again, Chris and Bobby Joe, for being with us today. We really, truly appreciate all the work you've been doing. It's really important, and it's wonderful that you're doing it. Thank you so much, and have a good day. Miigwech, everybody, for listening to us, and have a great rest of your day. Miigwech.